All right, hello, fellow coders. Welcome to this first lesson in the series of lessons that you're going to be receiving from yours truly. My name is Trevor Page. I'm an expert Java programmer. I know the full stack in Java, which means I can create a web application from scratch doing what you call the presentation layer, the server side, as well as the back end, which means I can do it all, and that is my goal with you. I want to be able to teach you everything you need to know to be able to build web applications from scratch using Java, because that is where the jobs are at, ladies and gentlemen. Java does 5 times more in terms of availability, has 5 times more in terms of availability in jobs versus any other language on the market today. So I should say 4 to 5 times. I think it's like 4.5 or 4.4 times more jobs in Java are available for the taking than any other language out there. So that's why I think it's important to learn the Java language. So let's start with the more or less basics of the Java programming language. Across a series, I'm going to make an assumption that you have a little bit of knowledge when it comes to programming. If you've come from a different programming language like C#, this is going to be very easy for you. If you come from a language like a .NET, another like a Visual Basic type language, there's a bit of a learning curve. That's sort of the path that I took. I went through Visual Basic first and then came to Java, so some of the things were a bit tricky. I'll try my best to explain for those people. Or if you're coming from any other sort of object-oriented language, then you're going to have a pretty good time going through these tutorials. For those of you who have never programmed before, this will be a little bit more difficult, but you can absolutely follow along with these tutorials. I'm going to try my best to sort of play middle ground between those with enough experience and those with no experience whatsoever. All right? So let's start with the topic of variables. Okay, variables. Hold on to my thing here. Variables and something called control structures. Okay, so that's essentially what we're going to be talking about in this lesson, control structures. So first up is the topic of variables. A variable, I'll be very, very quick with this. A variable is sort of like it's a placeholder for some sort of data that that can be interchanged, sort of at will when needed. So, for example, you might have seen this on a website, way back when in the early '90s or something like that, when websites were coming out. It might ask you for your name. You might get a pop-up that says, "Hey, what's your name?" Okay, I guess I can draw that out for you. You get a pop-up that comes up, and it says, what's your name? ? And there's maybe like a text area there with maybe some sort of a button that you can click on to say okay. And you would type in your name. So like, for example, you type in Trevor, and then you check the box, and there you go. So what it would do is it would take the value that you typed in here, in this case Trevor, it would take that value, it would grab it and place it into something called a variable. So let's say in this case we have a variable called name. Okay, a variable called name, and that is where we take this name, Trevor, and we store it into this variable. So that at some point later on, down in the workflow, you can say, hey, what was that name again? You could ask the question of what was that name, and then it could output the value that was stored in that variable, which is, in this case, Trevor. So you can store it into the variable and then call it back and ask for that value and output it to wherever it is that you want to output it. So that is a very, very brief explanation of what a variable is for those of you who have never heard of a variable before. For those of you who have, obviously this is very simple kind of concept. So let me erase this now and let's move forward to talk about variables as they pertain to the Java language. All right, now with the magic of post-production and editing, that has now been deleted. So now let's talk about variables as they pertain to the Java language, because that's what we're here to learn about. So let's stick with the example of the name. So we have a name, and that is the variable name that we have named the name. So maybe the word name was not the best example to use here, but a variable is made up of essentially two things in Java: the type of data that's going to be stored in the variable, and the name of the variable. So in this case, this is the variable's name. So I guess I can, draw let me say, put this in pink maybe. Say variable, we'll put var for short, name is here. And then before it is the type, or the data type for that variable. So in this case, the data type that we're dealing with is storing something called a string. So this might be familiar to you if you come from, like I said, another programming language. One of the most popular types when it comes to data is the string data type. Now, what does a string mean? A string can store things, a whole bunch of things. A string is typically denoted by like an opening quote, a double quote type bracket thing. Kind of like if you were to read a book and there was some conversation in the book, they would be in double quotes. So an example of a string variable type could be something like a name, because it has just characters in it, just regular old, from letter A to letter Z characters. Or you can have, it could say Trevor with a space, and then maybe a last name. Okay, Page. So the space there is not a typical character A to Z, but that's okay. It's allowed to store. You can store any character on your keyboard inside of a string, which means you could store a string called, you can have a string that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then, yo, or something like that in it, right? You can have a combination of numbers and letters as well. You can have special characters like an exclamation mark or a pound sign or an @ symbol, whatever you like. You can put that in a string, kind of like a swear word. So the point is with a string is you can store pretty much anything that you can type on your keyboard into the variable type of string. Now, string, like I said, is one of the most popular sort of variable types out there in the land of programming because it's so versatile. You can store any sort of data you want into it. The downside of it is that there's not a whole lot you can do with that, with the variable type of string. You can't really do a whole lot with it in terms of playing around with the data. So let's talk about sort of taking this and putting it into the context of an actual little, Java code, if you will. So the Java code I'm going to write is we're going to assign, we're going to do something called assigning a value to our variable. Okay, so that's sort of on the left here, that's sort of me describing it. On the right here, I'll write out a little bit of code. So we're going to take our string name. Okay, so that is the start of our little program here where we're going to make an assignment into the variable. So now how you assign things in Java is probably exactly the same as any other programming language out there. You use something called the equal operator, the equal sign. So this is an operator. The symbol equal is an operator in Java. We'll talk more about different operators probably in a later lesson. But examples of other operators are the plus symbol, minus, double equals. Again, we'll talk about all that sort of stuff later. So we're assigning something from the right hand side to the left hand side. We're assigning something to the variable. In this case, what are we assigning? We're going to assign the value of, let's say, Trevor Page to that variable called name. And what we're going to do here, this might throw off some of you coming from the Visual Basic language. We're going to do this little guy here, which is a semicolon. So again, let's dissect what we have just done here. There is the data type. I guess I've done that in a different color before. I should probably stay consistent with my colors. Let me get rid of that and grab my pink. So again, this is the data type. This is the variable name. Kind of hard to read that, my apologies. And then this is the actual, I guess, the value that's being assigned to the variable. So the type, the variable name, and the value. That's essentially how you assign, that's how you create a variable in Java and how you obviously populate that variable with some sort of a value. Now, what I want to talk about here is this semicolon. For those of you coming from a language that doesn't use sort of line terminators like this, you might be confused. Let's take a moment to talk about this line terminator. So the semicolon is used to denote the end of a line in a Java program. Okay, so if you're coming from like a Visual Basic language, it actually kind of figured that out when you use the return key. So in Visual Basic, when you hit return, you're going to a new line, and that actually means something in Visual Basic. Well, in Java, you can actually create this statement on two different lines if you wanted to. You could say string name equals, and then you could put a new line, and then you could put in double quote Trevor Page or whatever value you want to assign to the variable, and then you can put your semicolon. So in the world of Java, that's valid code. You can have it on a new line. Whereas I believe in Visual Basic or Visual Basic type languages where there's no line ending carriage return or no line ending character, I believe that you might get a compilation error. It might say that's not valid code with a new line. So this is just the direction that the people who created Java wanted to go. They said if I want to put a line break in there, then I should be allowed to put a line break in there. The consequence of that is you need to tell the programming language when you are done writing a line of code. Okay, and generally the concept around using a line-ending type symbol like this, like a semicolon, inside of Java, it's got one little sort of caveat where you don't put a line-ending character on a specific type of scoping type mechanism, which I guess I can get into right now because now we're going to flow into the topic of control structures. So just to recap. Or maybe I should give another example. Let me give a quick another example before we move on to control structures. So we have string name. That's one example of a variable with a type and then a variable name. Let's give another example. Like let's say an integer, and we can call this age. So maybe we want to store someone's age in our programming, or in our program. Okay. The data type is an int. The variable name, you call it whatever you like. I'm going to call it age. Let's see, what other sort of variable types do we have inside of Java? Double. We can call this, what would this be? I want to say money. Generally, you're not supposed to put money in there. A double could be, let's just say, money, or my money. My money. So first of all, before I go into that one, int means integer. If you're coming from a background that where you have a bit of mathematical knowledge, an integer is just a whole number. Okay, it can be negative, it can be positive, but it has to be a whole number, which means you cannot have a decimal place in that value. So your age, typically that's a perfect use for the integer data type. Remember, this is data types that we're talking about. The integer data type is perfect, or age is perfect as an integer data type because you don't tend to say, hey, I am 25.32 years old. Okay, generally speaking, you don't add the decimal place when you're talking about your age. Generally, you say I'm 50 years old, or I'm 25, or I'm 33, or whatever. Those are whole numbers. Those do not have a decimal place in them. So that is an example of when you would use the int data type when you're talking about a variable. If you tried to assign, if you tried to then say, int age equals 23.1 with your semicolon, that actually wouldn't compile. Java would complain and say, whoa, 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 you're not allowed to use a decimal point there. You need to maybe declare this as a double. Okay, so this is where this should be declared as a double because a double allows decimal points. So you could do 23.1 as a double. That is okay. But that is not okay for an integer. So an integer cannot have the decimal place, so you would have to say equals 23. And I guess I can move this semicolon over because I'm a little bit like that. I like to be a bit more precise. Good enough. So this is an example of age. This is an example of a double. You can have a decimal place. And there are many other types of data when it comes to storing data in variables, when you're talking about the concept of variables in the Java language. So again, if you have a background in this in programming languages, these should be fairly common to you. You should probably have a good idea of what these are and what sort of things you can do with them. And that's something, I'll get into that and sort of what you can do with these variable types, perhaps in the next lesson, not exactly sure when, but for sure I'll be talking about or touching on that subject. So now let's sort of take our discussion and let's move it forward into talking about control structures. Okay, control structures sounds like a scary word, but all it is it refers to the concept of modifying the flow of your code. So what's very important to understand when it comes to coding is that the computer has a very specific way that it goes through your code. A very specific way where it executes your code. So for the most part, the code will execute from top to bottom. So it will go for the first line, then go to the second line, third line, fourth line, da 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 da. So it'll go from top to bottom. And for the most part, it goes from left to right in terms of looking at the code and processing the code. I say for the most part left to right because in this case, it doesn't go fully from left to right. In this case, it might go and look at the value first on the right-hand side and then assign it into the left-hand side of the variable in this case. So it's more or less goes from left to right, but that's not a hard and fast rule, or rather that's not a strict rule. It's more hard and fast, if that's the right expression, meaning it's fast and loose. Let's call it fast and loose. Let's not use expressions. Let's just say, generally speaking, it does do left to right, but not all the time. But it should go from top to bottom in terms of flowing through the code. And again, these are all, I can't make the statement with 100% certainty because there's always exceptions to every rule, and there's always going to be someone to point out the exception to the rule. I'm trying to be vague, but I'm also trying to be helpful, so it's difficult to do both. So let's talk about a control structure. So a control structure modifies the flow of that code. Generally speaking, it modifies the top to bottom flow of code. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a control structure. So I'm going to get rid of this type, variable name, and value here because I want to do something underneath. And I want to create a control structure. So a control structure, there are a few different examples of what sort of constitutes a control structure. Where can I write this down? So I'll write it here. Control structures are, some examples are, you might have heard of an if statement, or perhaps a for loop. We'll talk about loops again in an upcoming video, or a while loop. Okay, so generally speaking, those are the big candidates when it comes to the most popular or most used control structures: an if statement, a for loop, or a while loop. Okay, so those are things that modify the flow of your code. So if we were just to have a bunch of lines of code here without using any of these control structures, then the code would flow from top to bottom, and it would mostly flow, like I said, left to right, depending on what the particular line of code is, what you're telling the computer to do on that particular line of code. But it will go from top to bottom without doing any sort of, if we're not using any control structures, it won't modify the flow. However, if you want to modify the flow, we can use a control structure. So I'm going to use an if statement. Note that Java is a case-sensitive language. So I don't know if this came through or not, but this is a capital S. This is a lowercase I and F. The fact that I'm using a lowercase I and F matters in Java. If I were to use an uppercase I and an uppercase F, Java would not be happy with that. Okay, so it's case-sensitive. You must be specific with your case structure type thing when it comes to typing in your data. So I'm going to do an if statement. I'm going to say if, and then I'm going to write something inside of my if statement to evaluate whether or not this particular thing is true or false. So, and I'm going to cheat, right? Well, am I going to cheat? No, I'm not going to cheat. I'm just going to toss you right into this. So I'm going to do an if statement and check to see if the value of a name, or the variable name, has a value. So I'm going to say if name is not equal to, so this is another one of those operators I was talking about, operators like plus, minus, equal sign, double equals, not equal to, that's an exclamation mark followed by an equal sign. If the name is not equal to null, then I want to do something. So null holds a certain value in most programming languages. Some call it null, some call it nil. Who knows? I haven't dove into hundreds of languages, so I can't say for sure every different combination of what they would use for the word null. But in Java, it's null. Null means empty, unassigned, completely void of anything. So what this is saying is, it's checking to see if the name variable, remember we need to refer to this, we declared it with this variable name. The variable name was called name, which is a little meta, but the variable name is name. We're using this variable name again to recall the data. Remember in our example where I had the pop-up box where we typed in the word Trevor and submitted it, and it would then assign it to the variable name, and then it would go and try to retrieve that value later. Now we're retrieving the value. We're saying, hey, does this name contain anything? Is it not equal to null? Okay, we could have said equal to null, but in this case we're doing a not equal check, which is something that's generally done inside of most programming languages. You check to see if something is not equal to null. So if the name is not essentially not empty or not null, then I want to do something. Okay, and this is where I'm going to do something that messes around with what we're talking about in terms of the line terminator. I'm going to write an open curly brace or curly bracket. I guess curly brace is the appropriate terminology for it. And then I'm going to close that curly brace down here, maybe right here. Okay. Now what you'll note here is, well, let me keep going. Now if the name is not equal to null, I want to do something. What do I want to do? I want to output it to my console. So this is another terminology, another thing that is quite common in programming languages is you have a console which allows you to sort of use as a means to sort of debug the code a little bit. You can take values of variables and output them to the console so that you can see what in real time what's going on inside of your application. So in this case, I'm going to output it to the console. How do you output to the console in Java? Unfortunately, it's got a little bit of verbosity to it. There's a little bit of syntax to go along with it. So it's system. Note, it's a capital S, has to be capital. If it's a lowercase s, it won't work. Again, Java is case sensitive. Dot, out, dot, and you can do one of two things. You can do dot print, and that will just print it right out to the console. Or, this is one I favor, print line, just print followed by ln. ln is short for line. Print line will output to the console and then hit a sort of carriage return at the end of it. So it puts the next statement, the next system out print statement you do will be on a new line when you do print line. So it's just a shortcut to say, hey, add a carriage return. That's all that does. So you can do print or print line. And I want to then output the value of my name. Name. And now I'm going to put the sort of line ending semicolon. So to explain what I've done here, again, we've declared a variable called name. We've assigned a value to that name. We're then checking and saying, hey, if the name is not null, so if it's not empty, then I want you to do something. What I want you to do is I want you to print out the name onto the console. Okay? So what's going to happen here is, and let's label this with lines in terms of lines of code. So this is line number 1, line number 2, line number 3, and line number 4 for our code. And we can sort of, separate our workspaces here. So this is our little program that we're writing over here. So there's 4 lines of code. And like I said, when it comes to control structures modify the flow of the code. So for example here, when we go from top to bottom, it's actually going to go from top to bottom, and in this case, it's going to hit every single line of code. It's going to start here to say string name equals Trevor Page. Great, so it's assigned the value Trevor Page to the variable name. It's then going to say if name is not equal to null. What happens here in this if statement is it's evaluating. Always, always, always inside of these control structures, there's some sort of, there's something that we need to evaluate. There's what it's called an expression. These are all little, semantics. These are all language or, flavorful words that are used in programming to make yourself sound smart, which I find is very annoying. When someone knows all the terminologies and everything, it's a bit frustrating to me because it's tough to learn all this sort of stuff. So anyway, this is called an expression inside of our round brackets or parentheses, and we are evaluating that expression because we are inside of a control structure. So I hit you with 3 big words there. Evaluating an expression inside of a control structure and determining whether or not the condition is true or false. So there's going to be a true or false. Always has to be a true or false statement inside of the control structure's parentheses. Okay, when it comes to an if statement, I should probably say, specifically the if statement. The if statement and the while loop will have a true or false statement that you need to make, or expression that you need to have evaluated. The for loop is a little bit different, but again, we'll get into those examples later. So in this case, it's going to evaluate to true or false if the expression inside of the parentheses evaluates to true. So if it's true, then it says, cool, it's going to go into the scope that you have defined for that particular statement, okay, for that particular control structure. So in this case, the scope is the starting curly bracket and the ending curly bracket. Okay, the scope is between the start of here and the end of here. Now, we could have had this all on one line if we wanted to, but since, Java is the way it is, we can put this on multiple lines. So what is inside of the scope of these two things? Well, there's only one thing, which is this line of code. So what it's saying is if the name is not null, it will output the value inside of the variable called name. Okay? However, if the value of name was null, in other words, if name equals null and we say name not equal to null, so in other words, we're saying is null not equal to null if the name was indeed empty, is null not equal to null, well, that expression that evaluates to false. It's like saying, is 2 not equal to 2? Right? 2 not equal to 2 doesn't make sense. That's false. 2 equals 2. That would be true. Does 2 equal 2? Yes, it does. Does 2 not equal 2? No, it does not, right? Kind of a double negative thing going on there. So that's what's happening here. If this was not set to, it did not have a value, then it would be null, and then it would say, is null not equal to null? This would then evaluate to false. And what happens when it evaluates to false inside of a control structure? It skips everything inside of the scope of that particular control structure. So if name was equal to null, it would not do what's inside of these brackets, which is this line of code. Okay? So if we change this, if we run this right now, if we were to run this code, what it would do is it would say, it would assign Trevor Page to name. Name is not equal to null. True, name is not equal to null. It equals something. Therefore, it would hit system.out.println, and what it would do in our console, let's say that this is our console window. This is my fancy console window. It would output Trevor Page, because that's what was stored inside of the value of name. And that would be the end of the program, right? So let's, I don't know, put a dotted line through here to say that this is the console or something. It would output Trevor Page. Boom, done. Now, if we were to reset this program and rerun it again, only rerun it after we change the code. Let me pretend I'm rerunning the code. It'll clear out the console when we go to run the code again, because that's the whole point of the console. It refreshes itself, I suppose you could say, every time you run the code. And let's say we also delete the value that we set inside of name. So instead of setting a name of Trevor Page, let's do something different, and let's assign the value of, let's just say it's null. Like that. Which is fine. You're allowed to do that. That is a perfectly valid expression. That's a perfectly valid assignment in Java, assignment statement. You can assign null to be the value of name. So now what will happen is, if we run this program, because we've introduced a control structure here, the if statement, it's going to run, hit line 1, do that assignment. It's going to assign null into name. It's going to go to line number 2 and say, if name is not equal to null. But remember, name is null. So let's just say if null not equal null, which is just like saying if 2 is not equal to 2, which is a false statement. 2 equals 2. Null equals null. So if you say, does null not equal null, that is going to evaluate to false. And if the inside of this, again, the parentheses of the if statement evaluates to false, if this is false, it skips what is inside of the scope of the if statement. So this is going to be false. Since the if statement is false, it's going to skip this line of code, and it's going to go outside and end. So in other words, what is going to be the output of this program? Nothing at all. It's not going to output a name to the console because the name was null, there's nothing to output, so it skips it completely. All right, so there's your little, brief enough introduction to Java when it comes to variables. We learned about variables with types and how we assign to a variable name. We didn't talk about the different types and how we can make use of and leverage different types. That's okay. We'll learn about that in a later tutorial. We learned a little bit about control structures, at least the if statement, how we have an if statement that has something that we evaluate inside of the round brackets. We obviously learned about some syntax here when it comes to Java. We saw the syntax of the variable names. We saw how to use the terminating line. Actually, I'll talk about that a little bit more right now. We saw how to use the control structure. So all this little syntax stuff, as well as how to output to our console. Very important things to understand when it comes to Java and the syntax of it. I find it's always the hardest part when it comes to learning a new language, is really understanding the syntax of the language. Now, briefly before I go, I want to talk a little bit about the ending, the semicolon here, which ends the lines. For those of you who are coming from the background of, like I said, a Visual Basic type language, you might be saying, well, how come you didn't do this, Trevor? How come you didn't put a semicolon here and a semicolon there? Okay, because that's what I was wondering when I started learning Java for the first time. I said, how come at the end of each line there isn't one of these sort of line terminating semicolon thingies? So the answer there, the best answer that I can give to you is when you the exception to the rule here is when you're using the curly brackets. So the curly brackets are used to outline scope, the scope of something. In this case, it's the scope of the control structure. So when you have an opening and closing curly brackets or braces, whatever you want to call them, you don't use a semicolon to end this line. Most likely, the best explanation I can give there is because the curly brackets are a special syntax that's used inside of Java that denotes sort of the opening and the closing of some sort of block of code. So it doesn't need to be told. You can't, because it's the opening and closing of a block of code, you're not supposed to end the line in your opening or closing block sort of syntax of code, just because that's the way Java works. I wish I had a really scientific and great explanation I can give to you, but the sort of best advice I can give to you if this is confusing to you using the semicolons is, if you see the curly bracket, don't use the semicolon. If you see the curly bracket, don't use the semicolon. Try to always keep your curly brackets, if you can, on separate lines. Some people will write this curly bracket on its own line. That's fine too. I do that too sometimes. There's actually heated debates around which sort of syntax is a better way to write it. Whether you should have a curly bracket on the same line as your control structure, or if it should be on a new line. Anyway, that's a whole different discussion. Waste of time if you ask me, but anyway. If you have like I said, if you have these sort of curly brackets, don't worry about using the ending line and line ending character unless you are writing a line of code inside of the scope of those brackets. Then you should always, end your line. So if I had another line here, like if I just said system dot out dot print line again, ln, and I had nothing inside of it, I'd put another line ending semicolon there as well. So all this will do, now that I have nothing inside of there, it just, again, it outputs a new line onto the console. So this is useful. You would just write system.out.print line with nothing inside of it if you just wanted to, boom, put another line break into your console output, mostly for readability purposes is when you would do that. But anyway, just wanted to do that to show you would be putting in the end line characters within the scope of your curly brackets, but you don't need it when you open and close your curly brackets. And also, before I go, for those of you who may be watching this video on YouTube who haven't yet signed up to the entire course here that I'm giving away for free, check out the link in the description below, or maybe I can put some sort of a link up here in the top corner to show you where you can go to sign up to get the rest of these videos, because I'm not going to be posting all of these videos to the YouTube. So go ahead, check them out, click on that, like I said, link in the description or the link above me here, and you can go and sign up to get access to this entire free course that I'm putting on that will help you to get started to becoming on your way to becoming a Java programmer. So there's plenty more free material for you to get. All you need to do is sign up so I can know where to send these tutorials to in terms of your inbox. So looking forward to seeing you there on that inside of that course. And yeah, like I said, happy learning. Take care of yourself. And as always, bye for now.